You could see it on her face the moment the verdict was announced. The confidence that usually radiated from Kamala Harris, the carefully measured poise that she had cultivated for years, seemed to crumble in real time. For someone who had built a reputation on being in control, always composed, it was a moment that exposed a raw, unfiltered emotional core that few had ever seen before. Her eyes widened, her mouth tightened into a line, and her hands, once steady, visibly trembled. Cameras caught her in that instant. No press secretary, no rehearsed statement, just pure reaction. She was stunned. Maxine Waters had not just been an ally. She was a symbol, a warrior, someone Harris had leaned on throughout her career in politics. They shared more than just party lines. They shared strategy sessions, campaign trails, and televised defenses of each other's records. Maxine was part of the inner circle, someone whose voice had long echoed with righteousness, no matter how controversial. So when the verdict came in, guilty, it wasn't just a political loss. It was personal. The foundation cracked beneath Harris, and for a moment, she was no longer the vice president, but a woman watching a mentor fall. The meltdown didn't happen all at once. At first, it was subtle. A glance down at her phone, a furrow in her brow, an anxious tap of her fingers on the table before her. Then came the deep breath, the kind you take when you're trying not to scream. Those who were nearby said she clenched her jaw tightly, struggling to stay composed as her aides whispered updates in her ear. The courtroom coverage played out, on the television just out of view. She didn't need to see the screen to know the damage. She felt it. She wore it. In private rooms that followed, the storm was less restrained. Voices were raised, chairs were shuffled, documents hastily gathered. The meltdown wasn't just emotional, it was logistical, strategic. How do you pivot? How do you explain your allegiance to someone now found guilty by a court of law? How do you balance loyalty with public accountability? The political machine sputtered under the weight of that dilemma, and Harris was at the center of it all. It was clear this wasn't just a headline or another news cycle. This was a break. The moment drew a line between what had been and what could no longer be denied. Kamala Harris had stood by Maxine Waters through every storm, every headline, every accusation, and now there was no more space to maneuver. No more ways to deflect. The verdict was a final punctuation mark on a chapter that could no longer be rewritten or reframed. What made it worse was the symbolism of it all. Here was a vice president, America's second in command, being forced to reckon with the very institutions she claimed to trust. She had long spoken of justice, accountability, and integrity in office. And yet, she found herself watching someone she had vouched for be condemned by the very justice system she had once served in. The irony was not lost on her, or on the nation. Inside the White House, aides exchanged knowing looks. Staffers shuffled past each other in corridors with downcast eyes. They knew that this wasn't just about optics. It was about legacy. Harris's political instincts, her ability to pick allies, her moral compass, all of it was now under the microscope, and the emotional toll was beginning to show. She canceled appearances, she declined interviews. Behind the scenes, sources described her as distracted, detached, and visibly shaken. What made it all more haunting was how isolated she became in that moment. The phone calls slowed. Allies who once praised her in every segment were suddenly cautious with their words. Everyone seemed to be waiting, watching how she would respond, what she would say. But Harris said nothing, not at first, because sometimes the silence is louder than the speech. Sometimes the weight of what has happened is too heavy to spin, too massive to gloss over. And so, in the hours and days that followed the verdict, Kamala Harris was a figure caught in the eye of a political and personal storm. Her silence wasn't strength, it was survival. It was the only thing left to hold on to when everything else had just unraveled before the eyes of the nation. Maxine Waters had spent decades in the public eye, a firebrand figure unafraid to speak her mind, no matter the consequences. She was, to many, the embodiment of resistance. Loud, unapologetic, and fiercely combative. She had weathered countless controversies, facing down critics from all sides with the same unyielding confidence that made her a beloved figure on one side of the aisle and a lightning rod on the other. But in the end, all of that bravado could not save her from the one thing she had never truly had to answer to: the rule of law. When the guilty verdict was announced, the room fell silent. There was no crowd cheering, no political grandstanding, only the cold formality of the courtroom. The verdict landed with the weight of a falling monument. This wasn't a minor misstep or a slap on the wrist. It was an unambiguous declaration: guilty. The evidence had been laid out, the witnesses had spoken, and the defense had tried its best. But none of it was enough to prevent the truth from catching up to her. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. At least, not in public. The woman who had stood defiantly behind podiums calling out corruption and injustice now stood before a judge stripped of her armor. There was no microphone, no audience of supporters, no catchy slogan to fall back on. Just silence, a defense, table, and the weight of accountability pressing down on her. The courtroom, once filled with tension and murmurs, was frozen as the sentence was read. It was longer than expected, harsher than many had predicted. Not a symbolic punishment, but a real, devastating consequence. This was more than a personal downfall. It was the collapse of a myth. For years, she had painted herself as untouchable. Her fiery speeches were viral sensations. Her interviews were must-watch television. Her defiance was celebrated, turned into merchandise and memes. But beyond the slogans and applause, there had always been whispers. Questions about ethics, about conduct, about whether the same rules applied to her that applied to everyone else. The whispers had now become a deafening truth. There were those who tried to spin it, saying she was targeted, that this was political, that she was a victim of her own visibility. But the facts were unrelenting. The trial had been public, transparent, and methodical. Witnesses were heard, testimonies were cross-examined, documents were scrutinized. And when the jury returned, it wasn't with a question. It was with a verdict. The law had spoken, loudly. What followed was a wave of stunned reactions. In her home district, some supporters clung to hope, but even they seemed shaken. The ones who had admired her for standing up to power were now confronted with the reality that she may have abused it herself. Political commentators scrambled to reframe their narratives. Some distanced themselves, others went silent. And for those who had long questioned her ethics, this moment was not just a vindication, it was a turning point. The legacy she had worked so hard to build now stood on shaky ground. The awards, the honorary degrees, the fiery speeches archived online, none of it could shield her from the gavel that had just come down. History would remember not just her rise, but her fall. And this fall was different. It wasn't due to scandalous headlines or partisan attacks. It was the direct result of legal proceedings, of facts, of decisions made in a courtroom where emotion had no sway. For many watching, the sentencing felt surreal. This was a woman who had once seemed above reproach in her circles, someone who spoke with such conviction that it was hard to imagine her being brought low. Yet there she was, listening to a judge describe her actions, her failures, and ultimately her punishment. There was no room left for speeches, no fiery retorts, just the cold reality of justice. Behind closed doors, her team was reportedly in disarray. Longtime staffers were shaken. Legal advisors were already preparing appeals, press officers scrambling to craft statements that could somehow salvage what remained of her public image. But the damage was done. This wasn't just a legal defeat, it was the undoing of a carefully built political persona. One verdict had unraveled years of curated defiance and righteous outrage. And even for those who had admired her, the question now lingered. Was it all just an act? Was the fire real, or was it a smokescreen for something darker? The answer, for many, was written plainly in the courtroom transcript. The fall from grace wasn't just about a guilty verdict. It was about the realization that someone who claimed to fight for justice had, in the end, been The courtroom was thick with tension, a kind that couldn't be broken by whispers or shifting chairs. Everyone knew something big was coming, but no one was quite ready for what they were about to witness. It wasn't the defendant who stunned the room this time. It was the judge. With a steady voice and eyes that didn't waver once, the judge became the focus of the entire nation for a few unforgettable minutes. In a world so used to legal loopholes, to softly worded reprimands, to carefully crafted statements designed to protect status and power, this judge stood as an immovable force. There was no drama in his tone, no grandstanding, just cold, direct, and devastating clarity. He looked down from the bench, not with malice, but with unmistakable resolve. This was someone who understood the weight of the decision he was about to deliver. Years of experience of hearing arguments and balancing lives in the scales of justice had prepared him for this moment. He had heard the evidence, seen the tactics, and watched every move in the courtroom. Now it was time to speak, and what he said sent shockwaves far beyond the four walls of that chamber. The sentence wasn't symbolic. It wasn't the kind of slap on the wrist so often seen in cases involving public figures. This was not about setting an example. It was about enforcing the law, evenly and without fear. There was no leniency offered, no carefully carved-out exceptions. The punishment matched the weight of the wrongdoing, and it was delivered with surgical precision. It was the kind of sentence that echoed, not just through headlines, but through every backroom political strategy session, every campaign office, every law school lecture hall. Those who were present described a stillness that fell over the room like a blanket. The usual courtroom murmurs had vanished. Reporters who were mid-note froze, pens suspended in mid-air. Staffers from both sides sat rigid in their seats, their expressions unreadable. No one expected the judge to go that far. And yet, when the sentence landed, it felt less like a surprise and more like a long overdue correction. This wasn't just about the person on trial. It was about accountability. For too long, many had believed that with enough influence, enough power, enough friends in the right places, one could maneuver around the system. This judge shattered that illusion. He didn't grandstand, didn't moralize. He just applied the law. And in doing so, he reminded the country that justice doesn't kneel to reputation or popularity. In the moments after the sentence, the courtroom remained quiet, as though everyone needed time to process what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just the length of the sentence. It was the tone of finality that came with it. The judge spoke with the certainty of someone who knew the facts inside and out, someone who had no doubt left about what needed to be done. There was no anger in his words, no bitterness, just a firm belief that the law must be upheld without bias. Outside, the media frenzy erupted. Cameras clicked wildly. Legal analysts scrambled to interpret the decision. Politicians rushed to either defend or distance themselves. But inside that courtroom, in the moment it mattered most, the judge wasn't concerned with how it would play on cable news. He wasn't weighing political fallout. His concern was justice, and that concern guided every word he delivered. What made the moment even more striking was how out of place it felt in today's climate. The public had grown cynical, worn down by countless cases where power seemed to shield wrongdoing. But here, for once, the script was different. The judge didn't allow personal history to cloud judgment. The courtroom, often seen as just another stage for influence, had transformed into a place where truth actually mattered, and where consequences finally aligned with actions. The sentencing wasn't about making a name for himself. It was about doing the job he swore to uphold. That's what made it so powerful. No theatrics, no lecturing, just an unwavering application of the law. And in that moment, the judge gave the nation something it hadn't felt in a long time. When it came to justice, clarity, fairness, and above all, a sense that integrity hadn't completely vanished from the system. It began as a slow ripple, an uneasiness that moved through the political landscape like a storm warning no one wanted to acknowledge. But after the verdict and the sentencing, there was no more denying it. The fallout hit fast and hard. Offices that had once operated with cool confidence were thrown into chaos. Advisors scrambled to draft statements, strategists huddled behind closed doors, and publicists attempted to manage the narrative. The conviction hadn't just shaken one figure, it had sent tremors through an entire political structure. In the immediate aftermath, the silence from certain leaders was deafening. Those who had previously lined up to stand beside her were nowhere to be found. Statements that once came swiftly were now delayed, watered down, or absent altogether. It was clear that the fallout wasn't just legal, it was reputational, ideological, and deeply personal for many within the movement she had helped shape. The once celebrated champion of bold rhetoric and street-level activism was now a liability, and everyone knew it. For years, her voice had been one of the loudest in the room. She had dominated press conferences, rallied crowds, and shaped conversations. But now, her name was being whispered behind closed doors, accompanied by furrowed brows and uncertain glances. Even those who admired her passion were forced to reckon with the damage done. And it wasn't just about the case. It was about what the case revealed. It exposed fault lines that had long been ignored, tensions that had been hidden beneath the surface of party unity and shared purpose. Campaign donors began to pull back. Organizations once proud to be associated with her suddenly revised their messaging. Talk shows that once featured her clips with admiration pivoted to roundtable debates about ethics and trust. The conversation had shifted, and it was no longer under her control. The power she once held to drive the narrative had evaporated almost overnight. The younger generation of politicians, many of whom had been inspired by her defiance and unapologetic style, watched with a mix of confusion and dread. Some tried to rally support, framing the outcome as unjust. Others chose silence, unwilling to risk their own credibility. They had grown up in the era where personality often overshadowed policy, where fire and fury equated to strength. But now they were seeing what happens when the rhetoric hits a wall, built by facts, evidence, and the finality of a courtroom sentence. Behind the scenes, think tanks and campaign teams revised their strategies. Those once aligned with her brand of political combativeness quietly began looking for safer faces to represent the cause. Her image, once plastered on posters and social media graphics, was being phased out. It wasn't a purge, but a strategic retreat. No one wanted to admit how central she had been to the movement until it became clear that her fall would cost them more than her presence once gave. For the public, it was a spectacle, but one that struck a nerve. People had placed faith in her. They had believed in her passion, her drive, her willingness to fight where others hesitated. But now they were left to question whether that fight had always been righteous. The sense of betrayal wasn't just directed at her. It lingered over those who had supported her, defended her, and refused to see the warning signs. In political circles, damage control became the order of the day. Meetings were called not to discuss policies or future initiatives, but to assess the extent of the reputational harm. Who else might be implicated? How deep did the connections run? Was this an isolated incident or a symptom of something larger and more systemic? These were the uncomfortable questions that no one wanted to ask before, but now they couldn't be avoided. Staffers who had built their careers working beside her were left adrift, unsure whether to stay loyal or seek new affiliations. Loyalty, after all, can become a liability in a moment like this. And as the dust settled, it became clear that her downfall wasn't just about her own actions, it was a test of character for everyone around her. The true fallout was measured not only in headlines or legal motions, but in the uncomfortable silence that followed her name, the awkward shifting of conversations, the empty seats where support used to be. Her conviction may have ended one chapter, but the shock it sent through the system was far from over. The movement she helped shape was now forced to ask itself what it truly stood for, and whether it could afford to carry her legacy any longer. In the aftermath of this political and legal earthquake, the nation found itself at a crossroads. The verdict and sentencing didn't just close the book on a prominent career, it opened an entirely new chapter in the conversation about integrity, accountability, and the cost of unchecked power. While the legal system had delivered its judgment, the deeper reckoning was only beginning. What does it say about a political environment where fiery speeches can shield flawed actions? Where loyalty often overrides responsibility? These questions echoed across communities, campaign offices, media studios, and living rooms alike. The sentencing became more than a legal footnote. It became a mirror. It forced political institutions and the people within them to confront uncomfortable truths. The myth of invincibility had been shattered, and with it came the realization that consequences don't discriminate. Whether famous or obscure, powerful or powerless, no one is beyond the reach of accountability when justice is truly served. For some, this moment brought a sense of long overdue vindication. For others, it brought disbelief, denial, or even anger. But above all, it brought clarity. In a time when cynicism about institutions runs high, and when faith in justice often wavers, this case served as a rare and powerful reminder. The system, when allowed to function without interference, can still work. It may not always be swift, it may not always be popular, but it can still be fair. And fairness in a world increasingly divided by politics, ideology, and influence is a principle worth holding on to. The fall of such a prominent figure also highlighted a broader challenge facing political movements across the spectrum: how to remain principled while navigating a system that so often rewards aggression over honesty, theatrics over substance. The real impact of this case may not lie in the punishment itself, but in how others respond to it. Will future leaders learn from these mistakes? Will movements that once rallied behind her take this moment as a warning, or merely as a temporary setback to be spun and forgotten? Only time will tell. But the message has been sent, and it rings loud and clear. Public service is not a shield. Fame is not immunity. Loudness is not virtue. The people demand more, and the system, when unshackled from fear and bias, is still capable of delivering it. That's what made this moment not just about a single trial, but about the enduring hope that accountability and justice are still possible, even when the odds seem stacked against them. And so, with the gavel's final strike, a new precedent has been set, not just in law, but in the hearts of those watching. A warning to those who believe they are above reproach. A reassurance to those who had begun to lose faith. And perhaps, just perhaps, a step toward restoring a broken